Russia is presently engaged in two conflicts. The first is the kinetic war in Ukraine, which received a lot of attention prior to the Gaza situation. The second is a financial battle, which is often underestimated. Despite the lack of publicity, the West's ruble-to-ruble campaign is just as important for the war's eventual fate as the trench warfare. It may be even more crucial now, particularly as Ukraine's disappointing 2023 attack enters what Valery Zaluzny refers to as a stalemate. Regardless, several perplexing changes in the economic environment have occurred. The Russian Ministry of Energy did something unusual on September 21, 2023. While most major news sources reported on it, it remained mostly unnoticed. The macroeconomic ramifications are complex, and a few things, including the name macroeconomics, put people to sleep quickly. However, it is a foreshadowing of a deeper economic catastrophe that Russia has been experiencing, while the West's focus has gone elsewhere. As a result, its ramifications are essential for how the battle will play out. Today we delve into the fundamentals of the oil ban, the ruble's weakness, Russia's efforts to stimulate the currency, the unconventional way Russia publishes inflation reports, the incentives to lie about inflation, Russia's attempts to mitigate the true inflation rate, and finally, the underlying logic behind the oil export ban. Let's start with the fundamentals and figure out why they point to Russia's deeper economic woes. In brief, Russia has prohibited the export of gasoline and diesel to any nations other than Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan, who are members of its Eurasian Economic Union. This union, Moscow's equivalent of the European Union, was formed because of the former Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych's last-minute decision to join it, sparking the Maidan Revolution and ultimately leading to the present scenario. With Western nations already sanctioning Russian oil, the countries most immediately impacted by the restriction were Brazil, Turkey, India, China, and Saudi Arabia, which stepped in to cover Russia's supply excess. The choice may seem odd, particularly in light of Saudi Arabia, a significant oil producer that requires oil imports. However, economic restrictions and prudent corporate practices play a role here. Saudi Arabia, although producing more oil than any other nation, utilizes part of that oil to keep its inhabitants satisfied. When Russian Urals oil sells at a $32 discount to Brent crude, Saudi Arabia wins financially by importing Russian oil, using it domestically, and selling the leftover oil at a higher price, typically benefiting locations like Singapore. This move enables Saudi Arabia to generate more money, a practice sanctioned by the West as long as the additional cash does not go to Russia. When the bigger picture is considered, Russia's decision to restrict oil supplies to nations such as Saudi Arabia becomes more reasonable. At the start of the invasion, Russia had amassed a sizable sum of money in a fund called Fortress Russia, totaling $643.2 billion over an 8-year period. Moscow had a strategy for the war, expecting to finance it with this special fund while continuing to sell oil for extra cash. However, the West sabotaged Russia's strategy by denying them access to half of the budget. As a result, Russia ceased selling oil in September. While one would think this was done to put pressure on the West, like the slowdown in gas supply to Germany via the Nord Stream pipeline, the fundamental cause was a lack of fuel. The harvest season was a crucial concern. Russia, a significant worldwide wheat exporter, supplied 14.4% of all wheat sold internationally before the conflict. After China and India, they were the third largest wheat producer. However, due to the magnitude of Russia's population, harvesting required a substantial quantity of equipment. Because harvest season coincided with the conflict, a postponement risked the wheat dying when winter came. Furthermore, throughout Putin's tenure, an implicit agreement existed between the Kremlin, Russia's government, and its people. People were free to live their lives as long as they avoided becoming engaged in Kremlin politics, and the Kremlin avoided dangerous foreign policies that affected Russians' everyday lives. When Putin originally announced the invasion, he referred to it as a special military operation to prevent widespread mobilization. However, later developments, particularly those in September 2022, call this story into question. One factor that is less visible to the West is the high gas cost that Russian residents have been facing. Given that Europe has ceased importing Russian oil, This may seem puzzling to those unfamiliar with sanctions. The few overseas customers that remain interested in Russian oil are ready to pay far less. As a result, one can anticipate an excess of inexpensive oil inside Russia. However, inflation and a weak Russian currency complicate matters. Official inflation rates in Russia were frightening in the first year of the conflict and started almost immediately. Money, which is basically a representation of a country's commodities and services for sale, loses value when there are less available to purchase. Sanctions caused supply chain difficulties in Russia, notably for things manufactured in Russia that required components from the West. Dice and other common products vanished from stores, and although rubles remained in circulation, there were fewer items available for purchase. Scarcity caused price increases, which resulted in inflation. As the conflict started, Russians began to worry that their rubles would become worthless. This triggered a rush to banks, either to convert rubles for a more stable currency or to purchase products before they become too expensive. This rush caused two problems. The ruble's value fell because of increasing exchanges, and prices surged even more as more money chased fewer items. To address these concerns, Russia's central bank increased interest rates from 9.5% to 20%, enticing customers to put their money in the bank by giving higher interest rates and taking steps to calm the situation. This decreased expenditure and helped manage inflation by reducing panic-induced bank runs. The tension emerges, however, from the fact that high interest rates ultimately result in more money entering bank accounts. People tend to spend more on items as their savings grow. Inflation happens if there is no equivalent growth in output. Higher interest rates also make borrowing money for manufacturing more costly for enterprises, thereby hindering long-term output growth. While the United States raised interest rates to handle a similar inflation situation in 2022. And 2023, Russia adopted more drastic actions. Russia hiked interest rates to 20% in April 2022, matching the all-time high achieved by the United States in 1980. The tactic was successful as rates progressively fell over the next several months, reverting to more typical levels. However, the situation is tricky since high interest rates bring more money into bank accounts, and individuals will want to spend that money on things at some point. Inflation might return if output does not rise in tandem. Russian enterprises encounter challenges in boosting output, such as issues obtaining critical materials, the departure of persons with the means to establish firms due to military conscription, and rivalry for resources in the war industry. Because of the military's requirement for supplies, raw resources and manpower have shifted into military manufacturing, diminishing civilian goods output. This shortage adds to increased costs and, as a consequence, inflation. Official inflation rates in Russia show an unusual tendency when published in a conventional way. Despite the conflict and economic difficulties, published results seem to be lower than predicted, prompting mistrust. The Kremlin was suspected of ordering the release of deceptively low statistics in February 2023. The published data for March and April indicated a sharp dip from 11.8% and 11% respectively to 3.5% and 2.3% before progressively rising in the following months. Inflation interpretation is intrinsically difficult, requiring extensive mathematics and complex economic calculations. Inflation rates are often provided as year-over-year annualized monthly statistics. The most current inflation figures from Russia compare prices in the same months of various years, demonstrating that, although prices are higher than in March 2022, the pace of growth has moderated since February 2023. The accuracy of Russia's stated inflation figures is disputed, unlike official interest rates, which are constantly monitored by central banks. Inflation is simpler to manipulate and conceal. Russia has three clear incentives to misrepresent its true inflation rate: projecting economic strength to the West, maintaining domestic political stability by downplaying inflation issues, and avoiding the wage price spiral, which occurs when rising prices lead to increased wage demands, exacerbating inflation. Putin agreed that inflation was harming companies in September when the annual rate was 5.1% and the monthly rate was 0.28%. Total inflation is expected to be 5.55% in 2023. If these figures are correct, they show corporate challenges in the face of inflationary pressures. However, when inflation rose to 6% in September, the central bank increased interest rates to 13%. Despite these measures, inflation remained, causing the Fed to raise interest rates to 15% by the end of October. While official October figures are not yet available, evidence indicates that the inflation situation is intensifying. To put things in perspective, US inflation peaked at 9.1% in June 2022. If Russia's estimates are correct, the 6% inflation rate may not seem terrible, but there are worries about the possible ramifications if inflation continues to grow despite the 15% interest rate. The central bank's framing of the problem does not hide the fundamental issues confronting Russia's economy. Shifting our attention to public reactions, one approach during periods of high inflation is to transfer money into a more stable currency. This takes us to the Russian ruble exchange rate, a critical indication of the situation. The Kremlin made three key moves to regulate the ruble's exchange rate at the start of the conflict. First, capital restrictions were imposed, setting stringent limitations on foreign currency withdrawals to prevent dollars or euros from becoming the country's major payment method. Second, local lenders were barred from making loans in foreign currency, requiring them to utilize rubles. Russian businesses, particularly energy exporters, were forced to convert 80% of their foreign currency revenues into rubles. These efforts originally gave the ruble the appearance of being stronger. Prior to the conflict, 100 rubles could have been $1.30 by the end of 2021. However, when the conflict began on March 10, 2022, the exchange rate fell to 70 cents. Surprisingly, it had recovered to $1.80 by June 30th, reaching pre-war values. Unfortunately, this apparent recovery was just transitory, as the ruble began to lose value by December 2022. It was $1.01 in October 2023, a 28% reduction from pre-war values, before rising somewhat to $1.09 in November. This leads us back to the prohibition on oil exports. Consider operating a manufacturing company to comprehend its relevance. While selling locally enables you to retain all revenue, selling overseas in strong foreign currencies benefits you. However, political problems may compel a price reduction. The decision is either to raise local pricing to balance the situation, or to face scarcity as overseas purchasers pay less than the true worth. Russia has always compensated oil corporations to retain their goods inside the nation. However, due to the financial strains of the war, these payments were cut in half in September. This decision, along with oil corporations flooding overseas markets to offset the payments, pushed the Kremlin to impose an oil export restriction. This action, although preventing shortages, lowering market prices, and lowering inflation, was not economically efficient. Fuel prices increases and cuts to government retirement programs are two reasons that might irritate the average person. Putin has seen the consequences of the latter, as seen by the failed 2018 pension reform scheme and accompanying popular discontent. The oil export prohibition seems to have been imposed to assure popular contentment, political stability, and Putin's continued rule. This was a good thing for Ukraine since it meant less money for the conflict. Furthermore, it suggests that Russians may be dissatisfied with the invasion. In view of the oil embargo, Ukraine's approach in 2023 looks to be justifiable. It implies that although Russians are willing to accept somewhat increased transportation expenses, they fiercely object to another round of conscription. The export embargo, however, did not last permanently. To refill the war fund, Russia restarted oil exports in early October, enabling firms to export up to half of their fuel. This decision, however, was accompanied by the resumption of damper payments, which diverted $4 billion away from the war effort. Finally, the economic complexities and geopolitical dynamics of Russia's oil export embargo illustrate the delicate balance that the Kremlin is attempting to maintain. The interaction of inflation, interest rates, currency exchange rates, and public mood offers substantial problems to Russia's economic and political stability. As events evolve, the international community will carefully examine the unfolding situation and its possible influence on Ukraine's protracted war. So, what are your thoughts on all of this? Let us know in the comments. As always, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date in the world of economics.